This past summer, I met a very interesting man, a friend of some friends from Massachusetts. They had come up in a couple of cars. There was probably 6 or 7 or 8 of us there that day. They had come up for a day of shooting. We went to the gun range that I belong to in Sanford, and we shot some guns, and there was one young, not young lady anymore, but I've noticed that she was young. There was one lady there that wanted to learn how to shoot, so we were teaching her a little bit. And we were having a great day. It turned out to be a very special day. Not only was it beautiful sunshine, and it was also the last time I saw my buddy Brian before he died suddenly, like 2 weeks from then, or 1 week from then, or some short time after that. So it was very special for that reason. And it was great Christian fellowship. These folks, almost all of them, except the guy I'm going to talk about, I had known from my church down there, Grace Chapel in Lexington. After shooting, we had lunch outside in the beautiful sunshine, practically on the tarmac of the Sanford Airport. Have you been there? I think it's called the Pilot's Cove Cafe. It's a great spot if you like seeing planes take off and land, especially the little planes. One time I was there, and there was this one hot rodder plane that all he did was we watched him take off, and he was taking off in, like, it seemed like from here to the back wall, and he would go straight up. And there was a worker there, and I asked about that guy, and he said, "Oh, he is a hot rodder. That's one of the top performing planes around, and he's practicing those quick takeoffs and climbing straight up into the air." Well, seated next to me was this guy Kevin, who I hadn't met before that day, and we got to talking, and I became impressed with his Christian character and his biblical perspective. He seemed like a very mature, very thinking, very devout Christian man. And then I asked him what he did for work, and it got even more better. That's not the right way to say it. It got more interesting. He turns out he heads up a company that is brand new, and it's like a joint venture with Raytheon in Massachusetts. Raytheon has got another name now, but we all know it by Raytheon. And he's in charge of, with this company, smallish company, bringing the Iron Dome to America. The Iron Dome that just, was responsible for most of the miraculous shooting down of all the missiles and everything else that was fired in Israel. Somehow someone decided, hey, we need that here in America. And this guy is in charge of that. And I looked it up afterwards just to make sure this guy wasn't some kook just telling you stories. And they have contracted with somehow they were incentivized by Arkansas and the governor there, Sandra Huckabee Sanders, right?
Yes.
To build the first systems that will start to be deployed around our country. And he explained to me, I guess the thing is we have missiles that protect the homeland, but they're super, super expensive, millions of dollars. He said the main missile, I believe, is the Patriot missile. And every time, and that could be gone like this in a serious, prolonged attack system, because we don't have enough of those because they're so expensive. But this Iron Dome system is very less expensive for each one of those rockets, and so it can be sustained for so much longer. Well, I did something that I've never done with anybody, especially at a first meeting. I asked if he would like to perhaps come here to the Village Baptist Church and talk about his testimony, because I was impressed with that. Talk about Israel, because he goes to Israel and works with Israel as a result of this, and what's going on there now, and what's going on in the world, and get his perspective, and even talk about what his company is doing. And so, by the way, I left my phone in there, but I was going to read to you the text, because what happened was, I hadn't heard from him. We hadn't talked since that offer. My friends were kind of slack-jawed. They said out loud there, well, Pastor Joe never asked us to come and speak. And I don't remember what I said, but I wish that I had said, these two guys, my buddies, are in commercial real estate, I wish that I had said, well, you know what, guys, Alan and Brian, I think the Village Baptist Church might find more interesting the Iron Dome than commercial real estate. I don't know if I said it or not. So I've never done that before, and I hadn't heard from him. And then last Sunday morning before church, I got a really nice text from him, and he said, I haven't stopped thinking about that, and I would like to come. And so I talked to a couple of people, Ruth and Tom, and we thought maybe Friday night, not this Friday, but a Friday night, like we do the missionary dinner, dinner and then the speaker and then a chance to ask him questions. And I don't think we did that this winter, did we? Usually we, during the winter, have that kind of experience. So look for that. We're working on that, and I think it would be super interesting and insightful. So that's coming, I hope. And that'll be great because what's going on with Israel now is also what Paul is talking about in Romans, where we're going to look today, at the end of chapter 11. In fact, at the end of chapter 11, he's really going to shift gears and he's going to pretty much stop talking about what he's been talking about since the beginning, and especially since in the last 3 chapters, how the gospel affects Israel and the Gentiles, and how we are to think about Israel versus the Gentiles. And we talked about that a little bit last week. God gave a special revelation to Israel for 2,000 years, from Abraham to Christ. And then when Christ came, Israel, who should have been the first to embrace the Christ, should have been the first to recognize him, should have been the first to open their arms up and receive the Savior, didn't. And Paul has explained, and God used that opportunity, God actually planned for that occasion to then turn to the Gentiles, the rest of us, the rest of the world. And then for the last 2,000 years, the gospel has primarily taken root with the Gentiles. And there's this back and forth, 2,000 years for Israel, 2,000 years for the Gentiles now. Paul didn't know that, but it's been 2,000 years now. But in the end, there'll be a turning back to Israel with the gospel. And Paul talked about that last week, in the passage we looked at last week, and he's going to reference that again today. He's talked about it a little earlier as well. He writes in our passage today, in verse 26 of chapter 11, we'll turn there in a minute, He writes in our passage today, and so all Israel will be saved. That's what he writes. Well, that sounds wonderful, and whatever is coming, it will be wonderful because God is wonderful, and God has planned wonderful things for those who put their faith in him. And whatever that means, and so all Israel will be saved, it will be wonderful. Whatever it means. But I'm not sure what it means. So let's take a look at it. Would you turn to page 803 of your Pew Bible, Romans chapter 11. We're going to read 25 through 36. We're not going to cover all that, but we're going to read that right now. Page 803, I believe, and Romans chapter 11, verses 25 through 36. Okay, Romans chapter 11, verses 25. We're going to read all the way to the end of the chapter. I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And so, all Israel will be saved, as it is written. The deliverer will come from Zion. He will turn godlessness away from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. As far as the gospel is concerned, they are enemies under count. But as far as election is concerned, they are loved on account of the patriarchs. For God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. Just as you, who were at one time disobedient to God, have now received mercy as a result of their disobedience, so they too have now become disobedient in order that they too may now receive mercy as a result of God's mercy to you. For God has bound all men over to disobedience so that he may have mercy on them all. Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out! Who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? Who has ever given to God that God should repay him? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. Paul knows that the future will be wonderful for God's people. He knows that for sure. We know that it will be wonderful for God's people because God is wonderful and his plans for us are wonderful. A wonderful future for all eternity, for all who will put their trust in him. And the Bible makes that clear. And there's only one way to have that wonderful future. Put your trust in him. Paul has been talking about that almost since the beginning of the letter. That's the only way to be saved. Israel or Gentile, Israelite or Gentile, doesn't matter. Salvation comes by faith alone. Nobody inherits salvation. It's not a birthright. Even for a Jew, it's not a birthright. Each individual Israeli, each individual Gentile must come to God individually by faith, a personal, individual faith relationship with God. It doesn't mean muster up a bunch of faith. It means you have to meet God, and you don't meet him in the flesh, right? How do you meet him? You meet him by faith. All of a sudden you go from no faith or very little faith to like, hey, I believe he's real. And I believe he can save me. And so I'm going to ask him to save me. And I'm going to repent and I'm going to follow him. And someone who's standing in the room with you might say, who are you talking about? We're the only ones here. And you say, well, Jesus is here. Why do you say that? Because now you have faith. That's the only way it comes. It doesn't come by some kind of birthright. And sometimes people get mixed up about that. Even today, in our culture, some people think because they were born into the right family, they're a Christian, they're saved, whatever. The Jews would tend to think that way sometimes themselves. One at a time, though. It's one at a time. We must come to the Lord. That's how Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation of Israel, got saved by faith. That's how we all come to salvation. Israel had a special revelation, true, but that didn't give them salvation. That just gave them the opportunity to know God and serve God a little bit more directly. They still had to come to him by faith. A faithless Israelite and a faithless Gentile will both end up lost and without God forever. Conversely, a faith-filled Israelite and a faith-filled Gentile will be saved and with God forever. Paul has made that crystal clear. It's the most important lesson of the whole letter. But Paul loves his nation, and he has great hope for his nation, Israel, who is currently, for the most part, rejecting Christ. And at the end of last week's passage, he expresses that hope with, and if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. And how much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? Paul is anxious. Paul is hoping and praying and maybe telling us that they will eventually come around as a whole, as a big group. He knows and has explained that for the most part they have rejected Christ And if you were here last week, you remember the olive tree metaphor, one tree. Should I say the rest of it? God's plan for diversity, equity, and inclusion. But because of unbelief, they've been cut off. But Paul has great hope the Israelites will one day come around. Instead of rejecting Christ, they will receive him. He knows that a small number, him included, the fellow apostles included, have received him. He calls it a remnant. That's a very biblical concept. Remember Elijah said, hey, God, I'm the only one left. And God reminded Elijah, no, there's a remnant. There's 7,000 others who, like you, have not bowed a knee to Baal. In our passage today, he makes a very bold statement regarding the future of his fellow Israelites. In verse 26, he says, and so all Israel will be saved. He declares. And then he quotes from the Old Testament, as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, he will turn godlessness away from Jacob, and this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Sounds like Paul is declaring a wonderful future revival, an end times revival. Let's go back to the top, the beginning of the passage, verse 25. He starts off, I do not want you to be ignorant. And remember, by the way, sometimes in this letter he's turning sort of his attention from focusing on the Gentile believers, sometimes to the Jewish believers, sometimes both. Right now, in this part of the letter, you remember he's talking more to the Gentile believers. He says, who have started to perhaps look down on their fellow Jewish believers. So he says in verse 25, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, so that you may not be conceited. Is there any time when conceited is a good thing? Pretty sure there's never a time when conceited is a good thing. Paul is concerned that these Gentiles are conceited. I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. Hardening in part. They've turned away. They've resisted the Christ. Remember from last week and prior, I already talked about that. He doesn't want the Gentile believers saying, look at us, see how good we are. We received the Christ that the Jews who should have received didn't. And so look at us. We're better, we're smarter, we're more spiritual, we're more godly. Paul doesn't want them to be, these Gentile believers to be conceited. True, the Jews had every advantage. They should have been the first to receive, but they were the first to reject it. Verse 25 again, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles comes in. What does Paul mean by the full number of the Gentiles has come in? Well, Christ used that same expression, and there's basically no debate about it. He's talking about the end times. The end of what God is doing. The salvation of the Gentiles. What else does God have to do when he's done saving people? Not much. That'll be the end of the age. The full number of the Gentiles. What's the language here? The full number of the Gentiles has come in. The Gentiles have come into the kingdom. Once that happens, we're at the end here, and so what it looks like is that Paul is talking about a very near the end revival of the nation of Israel. All Israel will be saved, and that expression, you don't want to take that to the nth degree. That doesn't mean every single one, but it'll be just like we said, everybody from church was there. Well, that doesn't mean, somebody was missing. Well, somebody wasn't missing. There could be a few missing, but when you say everybody, the whole church was there, you mean pretty much everyone was there. Okay. this end times revival that he's talking about, if that's what he is talking about, how would that happen? Well, it could conceivably happen like that, possibly, that when the nation of Israel sees Christ coming, returning, with his nail-pierced hands, they'll say, it's true, he was the Christ, and repent instantly. As a matter of fact, to me, that seems like the scenario that would be most likely. But maybe that's not it. Maybe there'll just be a revival. We read about an organization, Jews and Arabs together, right? That are seeing more people come to faith in Israel than they've ever seen. Either way, that might be what Paul is saying, but it might not be. I want you to know that every time we do a new book in an expository sermon series, they recommended this at seminary, I do my research on who the best technical, believing commentator is, the best scholar on that book, and usually there's one or two or three, and then I try to figure out which of those commentaries I should get to help me work through the material as we go from beginning to end of Romans in this case. Well, a lot of times there's two or three, but in this case, there's one man that clearly stands out. His name is Moo, odd name, right? Douglas Moo, and he's considered the best. And here's his commentary. That whole thing is on just the book of Romans.
Wow.
And so there's a lot of material to work through, and I also have an abbreviated version of this from another series that I have, and so sometimes I end up with that for my studies, but I try to work through what he has to say in a passage in this, and I've read a good portion of this now because we're already in chapter 11. He believes that it will be a revival of the nation of Israel in the end times, and that's what Paul is talking about when he says all Israel will be saved. But with a caveat, he believes it with great caution. He's not putting all of his chips on that square. Wait, I should know about gambling, whatever I'm using a metaphor like that. He cautiously says, that's what I think is going to happen. But he has he believes there's also another very plausible explanation for what Paul is talking about, because he admits that sometimes the language that Paul is using here could be for all believing Jews in the end will be saved. Now the greatest argument against that is that's what Paul has been saying since the beginning of the letter. He's talking about it's only belief that'll get you there, and so now he's saying, all Israel will be saved, but he means only believing Israelites who have existed from the beginning of time to the end times. Then you might say, well, Paul, duh. You've been saying that from the beginning. This is not some great mystery. Remember, he introduces this in verse 25 with, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, so that you may not be conceited. And then he says, Israel experienced the hardening in part till the full number of the Gentiles comes in. And then in the next verse he'll say, and thus all Israel will be saved. But it would be very consistent with everything he said, that he didn't mean an end times revival, he just means all believers. And that would make sense here because he is summarizing now and ending this whole discussion in the next several verses. So, I have to admit that because I read ahead a little bit over the course of this time, and I looked at this passage in anticipation of getting here, and for several months you've heard me say that there will be a great revival in Israel in the last days. I've said it quite confidently. Well, as a result of my studies this week, I take some of that back. And I'm not so confident as I was. I, like Moo, hope that that's what he's talking about. Wouldn't it be wonderful to see an end times revival for the nation of Israel and our brothers, the Jews, our brothers and sisters? But maybe that's not what he means. He may be summarizing, he may be recapitulating. I do not want you to be, and that would work here, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, so that you may be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in, and so all Israel will be saved. That is, as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will turn godlessness away from Jacob, and this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. If you read through the Old Testament passages concerning the restoration of Israel, it's wonderful news. Israel will be restored. Israel will be blessed. Israel will enjoy the blessings of God again as the people of God. But you don't necessarily, but we can't confuse restoration with revival. And so when you read those passages, you have to be careful what you're assuming there. Is the passage talking about a great end times revival, or is it talking about the restoration of Israel to be all that God called them to be, just like it'll be the restoration of us to be all that God called us to be, individually and even as a group, the Gentiles. But of course, Israel has a different place and a different history, and one that they never fulfilled. So, I'm sorry for perhaps being overconfident in saying that over the last couple of months. So I'll say it now with the confidence that I have. Well, I hope all Israel will be saved in a great end times revival. Don't you?
Yes.
Wouldn't that be great?
Yes.
If that's what Paul is saying, this is the only place he says it. I think we should stop there.